Friends, I am thrilled that we're studying again, and I'm somewhat flattered and thank you, and honored that our numbers have held pretty well for this encore lecture. We have two encore lectures. This is the first, and there's another one scheduled for next week. Since we're in the middle of the Virginia Waterfronts Arts Festival, I'm familiar with the difficult internal calculus. If I leave right now, I'll get out of the parking garage in under an hour. But I'll miss the encore, and maybe the second encore, and the drama of seeing whether we can get Andrei Kasparov to give a second encore. So, as the lecturer, I'm quite touched and honored that we have healthy numbers here for today. And of course, every single student is precious. My first 10 years of rabbinic work were in a small congregation, and it was very valuable. And it was not in any sense just preliminary to the big show. It was important work in and of itself. And it was a powerful set of lessons that whether you're in a gathering of 1,000 where there is the glory of the sovereign, or whether you're in a gathering of 10 or even fewer, the important thing is that the divine presence should be with you. And that's actually one of the themes of the book that we're turning to. So now an advance outline of what we'll do this week and next week. William has been distributing study guides, so I hope you have a 3 double-sided page study guide. Everyone has one? Okay, I'll be following more or less in the order of what you have in writing. Think of a great tree with one set of roots, but at a certain point in the development of the trunk split into 2 trunks. Then think of each trunk as developing and growing sunward, developing a very beautiful crown. And then much later, the branches of the 2 trunks begin to intersect, so that if you looked from the very top, you would see a common crown of this tree. One root, one set of roots, 2 trunks, intersecting crowns. My image is designed to get us thinking about Judaism and Christianity. One set of common roots, the Hebrew Scriptures. 2 trunks, the faith community of Christians and the faith community of Jews. Today, 1900 years after the divorce, we find that we've got some kids to raise together. We've got some life tasks to perform together. We have to bear witness in an angry world to the power of compassion. We have to model in a world of hyper-partisanship the values of respecting each other because God made each of us and God's image is in each of us. We have to announce at the cost of being unpopular to a world which doesn't care about these values, that these values in fact are, to quote the rabbis, our life and the length of our days. So we have a common mission. So it behooves us to understand the 2 trunks that develop from this common roots, because we may have what to know about each other. It's time for getting to know you again. And I'm hoping that this process of getting to know you is one that we can continue beyond the confines of this year's lecture series. So, the rabbinic wisdom literature that I want to open up for you is a product, not dismissing its roots, but its own development, is a product of the first 2 or 2.5 centuries of the Common Era. And these are, of course, the centuries in which the followers of Jesus, later to be called Nazarenes, later still to be called Christians, identified themselves as being not part of the Jewish community. So it's understandable that Christians don't exactly know very well what's happened on the other side of the family. Right? After what is happening with the in-laws? We're not so sure, especially if the in-laws are outlaws. We're really not so sure. So the first mistake that I want to correct is the mistake of thinking that nothing ever happens on that side of the family tree. They dissed us at the wedding when they made such outrageous spectacles of themselves, and it's now 50 years later, and we still nurse that frozen image of their perfidy back then. Right? That's a common psychological failing. We don't stop and think that the other guy is also growing, hopefully, is certainly changing. So I'd like to let you know that there was a profound historical development in Jewish society in the generations right after the texts that are still sacred in Christian liturgical use today. And you wouldn't know about these even from the latest gospel. You'd know a polemical view of it from reading the church fathers, but you wouldn't know it from within itself. And I want to share that with you. So we're going to be looking at the first 2 or 2.5 centuries of the Common Era. And we're going to be looking specifically to see what are the fruits of the wisdom tradition as it was practiced in those centuries. The book that I'm going to be moving ever closer to today and describing and going into the text of it next week is called The Chapters of the Fathers, Pirkei Avot. It's also known as the teachings, the sayings, the ethics. There are many different translations. The word perek just means chapter. These are the founding fathers of rabbinic Judaism. So think George Washington and Thomas Jefferson wearing yarmulkes. Let me give you a sense of what was the big change in the world of the Jew precisely at that time. I need to show you how different it was to be a Jew 1900 years ago from what it was like to be a Jew 2100 years ago, let alone 2500 years ago. So let's start with the Bible. The main story of the Bible, as retold by Charlton Heston and Yul Brynner, but leaving out the spurious Hollywood love triangle. The Israelites begin their national story in slavery. Their formative experience is the experience of redemption. They're redeemed in quite a physical and political sense. They're redeemed from slavery. The exodus of Egypt is the birth of my nation. They sojourn into the wilderness where they receive commandments. We're going to be doubling back and thinking about this notion of commandment, law. And I'll say at the very beginning that in the mind of the author of the Hebrew Bible, the authors, these commandments are not a burden, not a punishment. These commandments are a gift of love. I love you enough to care that you eat a healthy diet. I love you enough, oh my little child, to care that you don't touch that hot stove. So of course there's aspects of don't do this, or yes, do brush your teeth. I don't tell you to brush your teeth, oh my child, because I dislike you. I tell you to brush your teeth because I adore you. So remember that for the Jew, these laws are all gifts of love. And the consequence of becoming that sort of society, a society distinguished by people being equal in the sight of heaven. Unlike the laws of Egypt or the laws of Mesopotamia, where if an aristocrat attacks and batters a slave, there's been no crime committed. Whereas if a slave lifts his hand to his master, that's a capital crime right then and there. You don't have that in the Bible. The Bible signals an egalitarian revolution precisely because we are all children of the one God. You may have heard the expression ethical monotheism. In fact, you may have heard it so often that it begins to sound trite. Because I know some very ethical pagans today. And unfortunately, I know some very unethical monotheists today. But historically, it was the monotheistic revolution that we have in the Hebrew Bible, which also introduces a vision of ethics that we respect each other regardless of social standing, because God's image, the image of the one God, is in each of us. And by consequence, and the Bible says this over 30 times, we're even supposed to love the stranger. We're not supposed to love our nation to the exclusion of God's other children, although love of our family is quite understandable too. So that's the constitution that the Jewish people ratifies when they stand outside around Mount Sinai and say, "We hear and we obey." Exodus chapter 24, 19 and again 24. And then they sojourn for a while longer. They end up in the Promised Land. So the basic story of the Bible goes from slavery to freedom to independence in one's own soil. Therefore, it's a big problem for the Bible when the Israelites lose their independence. The northern Israelites lost their independence to the Assyrians. Think of Byron's poem, "The Assyrian came down like a wolf on the fold." And they are what we call the 10 lost tribes. The Judeans survived longer. They too, however, lost their independence when the Babylonians destroyed their kingdom and destroyed the temple and marched them in chains to Babylon. We lay down and wept when we remembered thee, O Zion. As the Hebrew Bible comes to an end of its historical section, we see half of a consolation. The Babylonians themselves have been overthrown by the Persians, who have a remarkable experiment in governing an empire. They decide that it's more efficacious to let people be, more or less, than to have to suppress them all the time. So Cyrus the Great says to the Judeans, "You can go back to Judah and you can rebuild your temple," which is discussed in the book of Ezra and the book of Nehemiah. So as the Hebrew Bible comes to an end, historically speaking, about 2,450 years ago or so, you have no longer independence, but you have a fair measure of autonomy. And critically, you have the Hebrew Bible read to the Jerusalem community and seemingly ratified as, once again, the constitution of this religious and ethnic community. And it has a capital city and it has a center. The capital city is Jerusalem. The center is the Jerusalem temple. So I have to tell you for a minute or two the importance of the temple for Jews who lived 2,000 years ago. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12, limits to one site the places where an Israelite or a Jew might legitimately offer animal sacrifices. Was that challenged at all? Yes, it was. There were Jewish mercenaries living in southern Egypt in the Persian period. It was called Elephantine because there was ivory trade going on there. They had their own temple to God and they had animal sacrifices, much to the consternation of the Jerusalem priesthood. However, the local Egyptians were unhappy with neighbors who offered rams as sacrifices because they worshiped the ram god. So they bribed the Persian governor one day and massacred the Jews of Elephantine and destroyed their temple. ultimately that temple was rebuilt, but no more animal sacrifices there. So Jerusalem remains the one place in the Jewish world where the biblically mandated form of worship was happening. Now, I don't have any great love for a form of worship which involves slitting the throat of a little lamb. I have a hard time connecting with it emotionally, but part of the discipline of history is to understand how other people in other ages regarded certain things that might not resonate exactly the same way with you or me from our culture. For biblically informed Jews, that temple, that ritual, that cult was the vehicle for obtaining divine forgiveness. That was the place from which atonement proceeded to the entire Jewish community. Christians have an echo of this in the notion of washed in the blood of the Lamb. There's a Christian echo of this. So whether the people were totally politically independent as they were under the Hasmonean rulers, or whether they had a kind of a benign overlordship, as was usually the case in Persian times, usually the case in Seleucid times, less so in Roman times. But if they had their temple and they had their CEO, who was the high priest, they felt as if they have more rather than less of the independence, which is the core story of the Bible. And they have, critically speaking, the place where the religious life of the people can be renewed and regenerated over and over again. So the destruction of the temple by the Romans in the year 70 as part of the suppression of a Jewish revolt was more than just the destruction of a big synagogue. You know, there are certain synagogues in Atlanta and Cleveland known as the temple. I've always found that to be a tad pretentious. I mean, imagine if I was going to set up a Roman Catholic church in Pungo and call it the Vatican. So the temple with the definite article and the singular grammatical, the temple, the only temple, the only place. Moreover, the only place where regeneration of a religious sort can happen. I can give those of you who grew up with the Cold War fantasies of the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits an episode to remember. There were many episodes that dealt with the nightmare of trying to live through the chaos of a post-nuclear exchange. And in one of them, there's this machine, a computer, no doubt, which tells the fortunate few who have access to it which cans of canned goods are not too irradiated to eat. And then that machine is lost. That unique machine, the only machine which can tell us how not to die. Imagine that there was a terrible flood and all of Norfolk's water purification facilities were lost. Where would you go to avoid cholera and dysentery and typhus? How could you avoid that? That's a medical, naturalistic corollary to the way the Jews felt in the year 70. The temple is destroyed. We have nothing left to help us achieve atonement. The burden of sin will grow worse and worse, and we'll die of spiritual kidney failure. That's the feeling in the year 70. None of the other Jewish groups prominent in the year 70 had an answer for that. Not the Essenes, not the Sadducees, not the apocalyptic writers. The rabbis had an answer for that. And that's why they became the leaders of the Jewish people in the century and a half that followed the destruction of the temple. Moreover, their program of guidance and reconstruction was so profound that it continued to characterize the mainstream of Jewish life for another millennium and a half. And in some ways, it still survives today, which is why I was ordained as a rabbi and not some other title of clergy. So, what about Rabbinic Judaism allowed them to cope with the loss of the temple when no other organized Jewish expression could do so? The answer will surprise you, because it'll involve rereading some people who we are conditioned to think of as bad guys. The rabbis were heirs to the Pharisees. The Pharisees. Yes, those Pharisees. Although, to be honest, the rabbis also knew some lousy Pharisees too. There's this wonderful statement in the Talmud about the seven kinds of stupid Pharisees. Rabbis were very good on categorizing. What is foolish piety? Right? Foolish piety, one rabbinic example, is the man who won't save a woman who's drowning in the river because the water will make her robe form clingy, and he doesn't want to gaze upon her form, because that would be immodest. Reminds me of the Tom Lehrer song. Remember Tom Lehrer? Yes. About a maid, I'll sing a song. You know, the one who didn't have her family long? Not only did she do them wrong, she did every one of them in. But at the very end, when finally the police come by, sing rickety-tickety-tin, when finally the police come by, her little crime she did not deny, for to do so would mean she'd have to lie. And lying, she knew, was a sin. So that's the foolish Pharisees. So the rabbis know about foolish Pharisees, but apart from that, I want to tell you what you don't know from the New Testament, and for that matter, what you don't know from the writings of Josephus about the Pharisees, but that we do know from rabbinic writings. What distinguished them from, let's say, Sadducees, Essenes, other groups who were prominent in Judaism in the last generations of the Second Temple? The following insight. Holiness as a fundamental and as a generative concept. Holiness ought not be limited to priests in the temple. Holiness ought to be democratized. You and I should be holy. We should live holy lives. God tells the Israelites standing around Mount Sinai, Exodus chapter 19, follow these laws, and you will be a kingdom of priests, yea, a holy nation. How did we get from that, the Pharisees asked themselves, to a situation where only the priests are required to be in a condition of ritual purity when they consume produce? Shouldn't each of us aspire to be priest-like in our daily life? I know he would hate to know this, but Martin Luther was actually being Pharisaical when he spoke about the priesthood of all believers. Because that is a Pharisee teaching. Now, how did they fulfill this? For one thing, they had this radical notion that you wash your hands before you eat. Maybe you're Pharisees too, without even knowing it. Moreover, they said a benediction borrowed, now this is really the cheeky part. They said a benediction borrowed from the world of the priests. Blessed are you, O Lord, our God, ruler of the universe. You have sanctified us by means of the commandments. You've commanded us concerning the lifting up of hands. It's a kind of a ritual posture. So that's one thing. Secondly, you know that when the temple was standing, there were tithes. That was the basic taxes, right? Tithes from produce. The Pharisees were scrupulous never to consume from any produce that hadn't been tithed, lest they be trespassing on the portion of that produce that belonged to God. Because they were ethically very scrupulous. They also had principles of holiness in one's physical walking through the environment. This is what distinguished the Pharisees. Now, instead of getting bogged down in the details, let's remember their basic innovation. Holiness is not confined to the temple. The category of holiness inheres throughout the holy people living in its holy land. So a Jew buying and selling in the marketplace is constrained not only by general ethical conditions, but also by the commandment to be holy. And so on. Please.
Sorry, this is going backwards. So, like rabbi, I always thought like Essenes had rabbi. I thought rabbi was like a term like teacher, because they called Jesus Rabboni.
It's a little bit like doctor. You know, there are philosophical doctors, there's medical doctors. Occasionally, there are people who are known as doctor as an honorific. What's up, doc?
But so the rabbis they weren't like Pharisees and rabbis and Essenes and
So Rabbi means my teacher. Probably it's a little bit like in the world of martial arts, sensei, something like that, sensei. So Rabbi is my teacher. Rabban, with an N, is our teacher. That would mean a chief rabbi. The rabbis, capital T, capital R, already is speaking about a particular group.
Like the Sadducees.
Well, I don't know if Sadducees used the words rabbis, because they were much closer with the priests of the temple. But initially the word rabbi is an honorific applied to one's teacher before it becomes a distinguished social group. In fact, the use of the term only comes in around the beginning of the first century. It is just possible that written sources referring to Jesus as rabbi are the oldest surviving sources using that term. I haven't said Jesus is the first rabbi. It would sound like I'm saying that. I'm making a more cautious statement, that the statements that refer to disciples calling Jesus our teacher are among the oldest attested use of that honorific. Does that help?
Yeah, but the rabbinic literature, that comes from the rabbis and the Pharisees. They're
Post-Pharisees, you have this group which we can now begin to call rabbis by about the end of the first century. And next week, when we look at the text of Pirkei Avot, we'll see when the word rabbi begins to get used, and it's just at about that time. Okay, so a group which says that holiness is not confined to the temple has the germ of an idea which will help people to withstand the loss of the temple. You see that?
Yeah.
So if the temple is not the only place where we can obtain atonement, then we have hope of building up all of the other remaining and enduring aspects of God's word to us, such that life can go on, the relationship can go on, the covenant is not broken. At this point, I will quote for you two rabbinic statements. The first one is in a version of the book Avot called Avot According to Rabbi Nathan, chapter 6. Rabban, chief rabbi, Yochanan ben Zakkai, who survived the destruction of the temple in the year 70. There's a whole dramatic tale about how he escaped from Jerusalem in a coffin. It's a cracking good story. He ends up in a seaside town called Yavne, which is the Greek town of Jamnia on the Mediterranean coast, where there were apparently already some of these rabbinic figures, and he recreates the Sanhedrin, the high court, high academy, both in one, in Yavne. So there's a story that after the destruction, Rabban Yochanan, son of Zakkai, and his principal disciple, Rabbi Joshua, are walking past the ruins of the temple in Jerusalem. And Rabbi Joshua tears his clothing in a gesture of mourning. He says, "Woe unto us, alas for us, the one place where we could restore our relationship with God lies in ruins." And Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai says to his disciple, Rabbi Joshua, "Do not be aggrieved, my son. We have another method of reconciliation with God, and that is the performance of deeds of loving kindness." And then Rabban Yochanan quotes the appropriate quote from the prophets in the Hebrew Bible and says, "For I desire deeds of loving kindness still more than I desire sacrifices." Perfect use, perfect sermonic use of that text for that moment. Another statement in the Talmudic tractate about the benedictions that we recite. This one is about the benedictions we recite over food, a grace before meals, a grace after meals. It says, "When the temple stood, the altar of the temple is how a Jew found atonement, how a Jew found forgiveness. Today, it is the table in your dining room." First of all, what a radical secularization. So in a precise sense, moving out into the seculum, moving out into the world, of this notion of holiness. It's not the temple in Jerusalem alone where holiness may be found. In this day and age, without a temple, your breakfast nook should be a temple in microcosm. And we're going to see next week what that means. It means, first of all, that you thank God properly before you eat and after you eat. It also means that you have a conversation while you are eating that includes words of Torah. So that it's not only deeds of love and kindness, but it's also worship and study. Those three, worship, study, deeds of love and kindness. And remember that the study for the rabbis is never disinterested study. Study leads to fulfillment of these commandments, which are the curriculum of our study. Those three become the replacement. So that's the secret of Rabbinic Judaism. I'd like to show you briefly what are the three principal genres of rabbinic literature. And then we're going to see that the Pirkei Avot is the introduction to the third and, in some ways, most important of them. The first genre is the prayer book. We Jews have our version of the Book of Common Prayer too, and while it has pre-rabbinic roots, it is in substance the work of the rabbis. They taught us the language of prayer. At first, they had suggestions as to the themes of prayer. In your prayers, mention this theme and that theme and the other theme. And then eventually, there was actually fixed liturgy. Although there's still a notion that you're allowed and even encouraged to innovate and put it in your own words so that it will be heartfelt. But every day, the rabbis taught, you should have a daily check-in conversation with God. It's a hotline, no doubt. Probably have God on your speed dial. And you start with words of praise. God, this is just awesome. Just look at this incredible world. It also includes, if it's appropriate, some petitions. I could really use my health back, God. Thank you so much for healing me. That would be a wonderful thing, if that's your will. And words of thanks. God, I do thank you. Whether or not you answer that last petition, I thank you for all the miracles that you've done each and every nanosecond. I couldn't survive without them. Do you know there's even a blessing after a successful trip to the bathroom? The older I get, the more I appreciate that. And without venturing into the territory of TMI, I'll just tell you that part of the liturgy is, oh God, you create the body intricate in design, wondrous in function. If any of the valves that are supposed to be open get stuck shut, if any of the valves that are supposed to close get stuck open, we couldn't endure before you for a moment. Thank you for your wondrous healing. Isn't that a great prayer? My teenage students don't really appreciate it. Eventually, they'll join the Metamucil generation and they'll appreciate it. So, the rabbis taught us to praise, to petition when it's appropriate, and to say thank you as part of our daily conversation with God. Now, there's one big change. On the Sabbath, we don't petition. And there's an important reason why. The Sabbath in the rabbinic teaching is the free taste you get when you go into the gelato place on Kali Avenue. I forget what it's called. You know, they have these hemi-demi, it's not a demi-tasse, it's even smaller than that. It's a hemi-semi-demi-tasse spoon, right? It's very small, but it's enough to give you a lick, right? So that you know what their, latest wonderful confection might be, and then you can decide to buy it or not. So the Sabbath, in rabbinic understanding, is a hemi-semi-demi-tasse advance lick of the Messianic age. It's a time when the strife, the humiliation, the oppression that the Jew has to endure is just not filling the frame at all. What fills the frame is peace, is love, is companionship, fellowship, intimacy when that's appropriate. That's meditation, spirituality, gratefulness. That's the mood of the Sabbath. So we don't need to ask for anything at that point. In a later era, later rabbis envisioned it as follows. Think of the Sabbath as the Queen. When the Queen comes to visit Norfolk, the dignitaries meet the Queen at the airport and provide an honor guard, right, to be the entourage escorting the Queen into town. We escort the Sabbath into our community. That's the notion. We are dressed to meet the Queen. So that's the notion of the Sabbath, no petitions then. So that's the rabbinic notion of prayer. The second great genre is the rabbinic study and reinterpretation of the Bible. There's a legal dimension to this, which is what I'll be turning to in my last few minutes. But I'm going to talk about the narrative dimension first. The Bible tells stories, and the Bible gives laws. What's the point of the stories? What's the point for you today of those stories? Well, you could say the stories contain a moral. Each one contains a moral. We should read the story, learn the moral, and apply it. The stories tell us who we are. The stories ground us. The rabbinic insight is that simply rehearsing the stories isn't enough. The rabbinic impulse was to use them as vehicles for talking about today. And I want to give just the most recent example of a question that I received in my rabbinic work. Wednesday night, this past, we had a Passover community Seder meal at our congregation. And as I walked amongst the tables, at one of the tables, the student said to me, "Rabbi, we read in a Hasidic website that 4/5 of the Jews never got out of Egypt. Only 20% got out of Egypt. We didn't know that. How come you didn't teach it in Sunday school?" I said, well, first of all, because it's a midrash. It's a sidebar story that's not meant to tell you this is the actual meaning of the Bible. It's making a point. I said, Exodus chapter 13, verse 18. the Israelites left Egypt hamushim is the Hebrew word, hamushim. It means armed. Why does the Bible stop and tell you that they were armed when they left Egypt? Well, maybe because in 3 chapters they're about to fight a pitched battle against the Amalekites. And you wonder, what are they fighting with? Maybe that's, but the word hamushim is a suspicious word because it sounds a lot like the word hamesh, 5. Hamesh. So one of the rabbis reread that verse, not armed, but 1/5. 1/5 of the Israelites exited from Egypt. Now, why would you come up with such a startling rereading of the Bible so unsupported by the main narrative of the Exodus? Is there anywhere in the Exodus narrative where it suggests that 4/5 of the Israelites didn't make it? No. So why would a rabbi come up with such a thing? The answer is found in the Passover Haggadah. Passover Haggadah looks at the different moments where the Bible says, when your son will ask you, what is the meaning of this Passover ritual, you will explain, this I did because the Lord saved me from Egypt, and so on and so forth. There are 4 such moments in the Bible. In 3 it says, your son will ask you and you will answer, and in 1 it says, don't wait for the question. Tell your son, thus and such. So the Passover Haggadah, which is a rabbinic work, says the Torah speaks about 4 kinds of children. The wise child, the wicked child. We don't like saying wicked. We say alienated or disaffected, but the rabbis don't pull any punches. They call them wicked. The simple child, we call him a late bloomer, right? But the simple child. And then the one who doesn't even know how to ask. So the simple child, for example, says, what's this? And you got to explain it simply. The wise child wants to jump into all the details of the system, so teach him all the details. The wicked child says, Ma ha'avodah hazot lachem. What does this mean to you? With a sneer in the word you. What's this religious jazz all about for you? I don't have any truck with it. So then the rabbis say, you should push him off balance by giving him the following sharp reply. To me and not you. If you'd have been there, you wouldn't have been redeemed. Stick with us when we're at our low point in history, and you get to enjoy the great turnaround. If you're with us when times are tough, you have a right to be with us when we are redeemed. If you defect from us when times are tough, you have no right to stand with us when we are redeemed. That's what the rabbis are saying, not about the demographic census data of the Jews of Egypt. They're talking about their own time. Wouldn't it be so easy just to pack it in and move to one of the Greek-speaking cities and assimilate into the Greek culture of the land of Israel? That option was there. The Romans were not racists. They never said that because you had Jewish ancestors, you couldn't merge culturally into the majority of who we are. Racism is another sin, but the Romans were guilty of other sins too, but racism was not one of their sins. So assimilation, which from the rabbis' point of view was defection, was a major challenge in their day. But instead of simply giving a sermon about it, they retroject it into the words of the Torah. They said, even if only 20% got out of Egypt, that's the percent who are the carriers of the national destiny. And if our congregation looks sadly depleted as compared to a generation ago, because so many people have said, pack it in, that really is too bad, but that's no reason for us to despair. God redeemed even the 20%, God will redeem us one day as well. So you see how the Midrash works in the imaginative sidebar stories that they added to the stories of the Bible. They're talking to their own day and age. And the third genre, which is the one which we're going to conclude with today because we're moving back to this next week, is the legal genre. The main work that the rabbis produced is called Mishnah. Mishnah means restatement. It's a restatement of all the laws of the 5 books of Moses, plus all of the developments of those laws in the many centuries since those laws' first expression. Consider this. God is talking to a bunch of Bronze Age patriarchal shepherds. So God's going to put things in ways that they can understand. Now, we sophisticated modern Jews living in the 2nd century of the Christian era, which is modern for us because we're living then, right? We're not shepherds, we're not Bronze Age. We live in a world of complicated economic relationships. Where does God talk about business partnerships, about the proper way to constitute a corporation? Where do you find that in the Bible? You find that in the post-biblical development of the Midrash as is applied to the legal texts. And the Mishnah is a digest, which is a restatement of all of that. So if you read the Mishnah, which is a formidable undertaking, it has, not counting our little book, it has 62 volumes. It's 62 volumes of law, which I know, you're tired already, which cumulatively give you an entire picture of the world that the rabbis want us to live in. You know why? Because we have to render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. We don't have a choice in that matter. But if we live by these 62 volumes, we can also render unto God what is God's, and that will give us our inner freedom. Because the yoke of God's law is not at all like the yoke of Pharaoh's law, let alone the yoke of Nero's law. The yoke of God's law is actually liberating. Being involved in the self-disciplined life when you are disciplined according to God's loving guidance for you is a pathway that leads not towards servitude, but towards nobility. That's the main message of the Mishnah. The only thing that the Mishnah doesn't have in this description of a whole world is what gives the rabbis the right to write the Mishnah? Who are they? Who elected them? That's what our book is going to teach us next week. Who are the rabbis that they should be Christopher Columbus opening up for us this new world of life as a Jew in a temple-less world where our relationship with God is still meaningful and where the possibilities of noble living still enrich us. So now we're ready for Pirkei Avot. See you next week.